outrage sparked around the world. A black man killed under the knee of a white police officer.
George Floyd!
People from every continent, religion, and race are coming together.
I'm out here because it doesn't matter what color you are, it matters who you are.
Let's go!
Some are demanding change. Others want answers.
Many people have asked me that, what's up with the All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter? Nobody said, only Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter more than white lives. We're saying, when Black lives are taken unjustly and nothing's being done about it, it sends the sentiment that Black lives don't matter.
Some don't know where to start. Join an ISBA Conversation. Real change begins with you.
Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Azra Hussain. I am the co-founder and president of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, and you are joining us for our very first conversation titled Real Change Begins With You. I'd like to introduce you to our co-hosts. This is Rabbi John Linder. He's the senior rabbi at Temple Solel in Paradise Valley, and Pastor David Felten, who is the pastor at the Fountain United Methodist Church in Fountain Hills. Welcome.
Good to see you, Azra. Likewise.
Good to see you again. Good to see you, John.
We might want to make a point
Now,
of letting
when
people know, Azra, that due to technical difficulties, we have a frozen Azra, but you're still with us live.
Is that what's going on? See, I don't even know that. But thank you for taking care of that for me. Anyway, so I would like to go ahead and ask one of you to begin. John, how about you let our audience know why you want to be part of this conversation, why you thought this was a good idea tonight?
Yeah, thanks. And always, Azra, your leadership with the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, that's giving us an opportunity tonight to, number one, invite in a panel that you'll soon meet to hear, to see, and to feel other people's experience that we otherwise would not be aware of. So those that are showing up and watching this on Facebook Live, it's saying that you care about learning. This is an opportunity tonight to hear and listen to the stories and narratives of those in our community that so easily are marginalized, and it's not acceptable to us. David.
Yeah.
Well, I want to echo John's sentiment and gratitude to Azra for helping to organize this and being able to bring together so many people to have this conversation where we really wanted to do whatever we could to help people get a glimmer of understanding of what being respected looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like in our minority communities. Obviously tonight we're chatting with leaders in the Black, Asian, and Latino communities, but our overall goal is to try and help give people some real life tips on how to be good listeners, friends, allies, advocates, all of us together working to raise awareness about and bring an end to racism and bigotry.
Yes, and this was, I've been listening to conversations online. I've been listening to people and witnessing where people of one race reaching out to another and getting shut down with comments like, "Well, you wouldn't understand. You haven't had that happen to you. Somebody hasn't had 12 police officers show up and hold guns to your child's head." And I understand where each side is coming from. And I want to try with all of us tonight to at least give, like David and John said, give people empower them, give them the tools to be able to reach out. And even if they get shut down the first time, maybe try again, because they know where that hurt is coming from and appreciate it. And with that, we're going to now introduce our wonderful guests this evening. So, John?
Yeah, I get to introduce Dr. Cliff Moon, who I am meeting for the first time. And actually, Dr. Moon, just by looking at your bio, I'm excited to meet you. So Dr. Cliff Moon has a strong belief in individual and collective worth and is passionate about social justice. Over the years, Cliff has been engaged in the community through participation in the East Valley Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee, chair of the City of Mesa's Human Relations Advisory Board, the City of Mesa Police Department's African American Forum, and the Symposium on Poverty and Homelessness. Presently, Cliff is the coordinator of diversity and inclusion in the Tempe Union High School District.
Good evening, John. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Good evening.
And I get a chance to
David?
introduce Lydia Guzman, who is a lifelong advocate of civic engagement, and in that role has assisted thousands of legal residents to apply for and become citizens. She's served in various capacities with the Arizona Secretary of State, the Clean Elections Institute, and the Attorney General Office. She was instrumental in collecting racial profiling data on the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that later became part of a lawsuit against Sheriff Joe. And she's been involved in police reform issues, assisting in training various police agencies. She currently heads the Hispanic Advisory Board of the Phoenix Police Department and serves on the disciplinary review and use of force boards of the Phoenix Police Department as well. As an advocate for migrant rights, civil rights, and human rights, Ms. Guzman has been a leader of the League of United Latin American Citizens and currently works at Chicanos por la Causa as the Director of Advocacy and Civil Engagement. Lydia, it's great to have you with us this afternoon, this evening. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think that this is a great opportunity to start having these discussions, and I'm so excited to be a part of this panel. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this.
Welcome.
Absolutely.
Welcome. Well, I'm going to introduce Qaed Mai to you. Qaed is a father of 3 young children and works as a design strategist at ASU. Qaed is a Muslim Chinese American immigrant, and he has been deeply involved in his communities for most of his life, although he has taken some time off in recent years to focus on his 3 children. Welcome, Qaed. We look forward to our conversation this evening.
Thank you. I am wildly out-credentialed here, and I am very honored and privileged to be having this conversation and discussion with everyone. And just happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Cliff, would you
Yes.
like to start off the evening with helping us get on the way?
Well, sure. First, again, let me say thank you for Azra pulling this together. I believe that it is time that we do have not just courageous conversation, but that we have constructive conversation about inclusion and respecting one another. And I would just like to start off by saying that the ideas and the opinions and the thoughts that I'm going to share with you tonight comes from me, and that I don't necessarily speak with the entirety of all African American men, because we all have our own unique thoughts, our own unique passions, our own unique opinions and ideas about how we move forward. So let me speak as Dr. Moon, but understanding that there are some commonalities. When it comes to the question of how do I go about respecting you, I think that it's very important and imperative that you come in with the question of not only how do I respect you, but that you start to think about yourself. Where are you coming from? What are your attitudes? What are your biases? What are your values? What are your beliefs? Before you start to entertain questions about how you and I can get along with one another and how you can get along with the group that I identify with. And I think that we also have to remove ourselves from this, well, I just want to be nice to people, because niceness is not enough. You can still have problematic perceptions about individuals and still be nice. There's an author who says that we have to start beginning to practice what we call radical kindness. And what that means is that we have to start approaching individuals with a sense of mutual respect, with warmth, with empathy, with the ability to self-reflect on who we are and what we are before we can start to ask those questions about individuals who may be perceived to be different from ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
That
Azra, you still
was-
there?
I am still here, but I was hearing some music, so I thought maybe that was part of Cliff's presentation. So I stopped for a bit. I'm sorry. Yes, I am here. I would like to first remind our audience that we will take questions. Please comment in the comment section. That will come up, and we'll take questions throughout. But we would like to take a few minutes and give our wonderful guests an opportunity to speak and explain their point of view to us. Cliff, thank you very much for starting us off. Lydia, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm reflecting on what Cliff said, and I think as the shooting happened and when Mr. Floyd was killed, the protest, I think it gave me personally an opportunity to listen and to learn. My whole life, I thought being an advocate for civil rights, protecting people's right to free speech, protecting people's right to, to want to work, to want to live in a free society and everything. And, I thought I was the model picture of someone who's a civil rights, I guess, a civil rights leader. But a couple of experiences that I realized that throughout life, we have to go through a process of listening and learning. And I'll start off with a few years ago, while we were preparing for the racial profiling case, one of the attorneys that was working with me, she is an Asian attorney. And as we were discussing the racial profiling, I grew up in California, and there were so many different cultures. There were so many different nationalities, people of every background. And so I thought, well, I as long as you're nice, you think that you know it all, and you think that you're not offensive. But I realized when I used the word Oriental, that was an offensive word. I never heard that word used in a derogatory term, so I didn't know it was considered a slur. I didn't know, I heard the word Asian American, but I never knew that the word Oriental, when I described the people or or like trying to describe someone that's Asian American, was offensive. And this attorney said to me, no, Lydia, it's Asian American. Oriental is considered a slur. And I thought about it and I was dumbfounded. And I thought, my whole life, I never knew. And I go back to even a conversation that I had with an ex-husband of mine, who his grandmother was born and raised, I apologize. His grandmother was born and raised in Tennessee. She never left the county where she grew up in. She was 103 years old, and she referred to an African American as the N-word. And when my my ex-husband explained to me that they had tried for several years to explain to her that's not the word to use, and she never knew because she was using it to describe, folks, African American, and so she didn't know. And so now, as I hear a lot of what we're going through right now, when I hear Black Lives Matter, maybe a couple of years ago, I would have thought, well, why don't all lives matter? I know that Latinos are being targeted by police brutality, by discrimination, by systemic, by there's a lot of racism that takes place, and Latinos often are the receiving end of this. And so why isn't it that all lives matter? But now that I see and I hear and I'm listening, I realize that we have to, right now in the moment, the issue that's important and of urgency that we need to address to fix a lot of what's taking place is with our African American, brothers and sisters. And this is why we have to recognize how Black Lives Matter. And, I so many things have happened in these last couple of weeks. A lot of processes, not only with myself. I've asked a couple of friends of mine, and I was actually very embarrassed by this. And I said, teach me and tell me what I'm doing wrong, because I feel like I'm trying to have a conversation and I feel ignorant. I feel like I want to learn, but I don't want to be offensive. And am I being offensive by saying I don't know it all? And so I guess having these conversations, and I think it's a matter of, first of all, admitting that we don't know it all, but we want to learn so that we can be better allies, we can be better friends, we can be better colleagues at work, coworkers, or employers. And so I guess, diving into this, I'm opening up and saying we don't know it all. In my lifelong work in helping migrant rights and civil rights and everything, I realized I have a lot of work, a lot of things to learn myself. So, and I'm open to learn it with everybody. I think we all do.
Thank you. Thank you. David? So thank
Yes.
you, Lydia. That was wonderful. Your, I was going to again remind our audience, please, if you have questions or comments, please remember to go ahead and post those down in the comments section, either on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you are. So please do that. And Qaid, I'd like to invite you to speak, please. Qaid?
Mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muting myself and then forgot to unmute. So just another reality of our current situation. So thanks again for having me, and it's wonderful to be among such esteemed and wonderful other voices here. I wanted to try to keep this short. I feel that this has been such a great opportunity to really re-engage, not that we're never engaged, especially for people of color, with the issues of racism and sort of the legacy of colonialism that we are living with in America and in the West and in the world in general. And the problem with the narratives around injustices and social illnesses like racism is that we don't believe that these are embedded in every single one of us. I think we tend to think of racists as people who are good, and then racists as people who are bad, and everyone else is good. And so we are very allergic to, we're very allergic to the idea that we may be racist ourselves, and we have racist issues and embedded, internalized colonial and racial narratives built into who we are. But the problem is doing that prevents us from being able to engage with these issues. And so we really need to start shifting that narrative into believing that this is an illness. And like the coronavirus and other illnesses that we deal with, we're not getting anywhere by pretending we don't have it. Especially if we live in the sort of context and the sort of environments where that sort of thing can proliferate. America is a country we all have grown up in and love, but it is built on a legacy of racism and colonialism that continue to plague us today. And again, it's that refusal to engage with it that has allowed things to continue to grow into the state that they are now. So I think that for me, specifically as an Asian American, looking at the Black Lives Matter and the surrounding discourse around it, it's really important to, again, look inwards and to engage with the sort of racism that also exists and oftentimes swept under a rug within communities of color, right? As an Asian American, I'm very familiar with the rampant racism and anti-Black attitudes that exist within our own communities. And it's very easy to sort of sort of tunnel away into our own little corners and pretend that this is just a white issue, when really we have a lot of work to do on our own. The problem with pretending that this is an issue of, that dividing this into races and different groups of people is that the whole point of fighting for racial justice isn't that I'm fighting for Asian Americans or I'm only fighting for one group or another, but that you fight because this is the right thing to do. I'm reminded of a verse that is often quoted in the Quran about one of the most quoted verses in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat goes, "O mankind, we have created you from male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another." And it's often touted and used as a sort of, this diversity verse, right? Oh, we're all about embracing diversity and stuff like that. But when we talk about that, we oftentimes also just roll over the part about knowing one another. And I'm also brought to think about, makes me think of other philosophies like the ancient Greeks who felt that people were created and are not whole until they meet with others. And in a sense, we have to think of ourselves as individuals waiting to connect with a wider world. And it is in that sense that they feel that we can find that wider humanity and that ability to really connect with others. And that's why it's so important for us to advocate, not just for ourselves or for our own groups, but for everyone. Thank you.
Can I add something,
Wonderful.
Azra?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Kai. I also believe that people have to challenge themselves. They have to challenge, where did these notions come from? You see, we all have a bit of racism in us. And the reason being is that we have been brought up in a society that is built upon white supremacy. Now, some of my colleagues, when I use the word white supremacy, like Kayed was saying, is that they think there's the good racist, there's the bad racist, or I'm not racist at all. And the point is that we all have a tinge of that in us. And what I try to get my colleagues to do is to take a look at their history. What did your parents, what did your relatives say about people of color? And if there was no one within the family to challenge any sort of negative notions, then you were indoctrinated, you were brainwashed into believing that white was right. If we take a look at the institutional policies that have been created, white people tend to be the norm for any policies or any laws. And the idea being that if it's good enough for the dominant race, which is white, and by the way, there is no such thing as race, but if it's for the dominant society, then it must be good enough for everyone. And so white supremacy, I'm not talking about the Klan, I'm not talking about the Aryan Brotherhood, I'm talking about the way our system of society has been put together from the founding of this nation up to 2020. And so we have to challenge this notion. And that means that we're going to have to be really critical about what we believe and what we say. If I've been brought up to think of Asian Americans as Orientals, then it's going to be hard for me to move away from that thought process and to believe that that's a part of the white supremacist sort of thinking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Azra, can I respond to just a few things that I heard?
Please.
Yeah.
Please.
So So first of all, already just such a rich panel, and Kayed, you are not out-credentialed. You just really, really articulate and poignant, and there is racism in each of us, and I think what I heard from each of the panelists, that we can be in solidarity with one another, and it doesn't diminish our own story. So we need to somehow shed the defensiveness to be able to listen, and it's not easy. And I am wondering if the panelists have any just any insight to around that as you are presenting yourself to somebody else, and somebody becomes a little defensiveness, feeling that they need to insert their own story, how to handle that.
Yeah, may I speak? Yeah, I think you raise a good question. And what I try to get across to individuals, especially in my professional development sessions, is that we come from a very individualistic society where there has to be a degree of dominance, and there has to be a right or there has to be a wrong, and there is no middle latitude. And so what I try to get people to understand is that when we have these sort of conversations, that you have to understand the truth that I'm trying to give to you. And I'm asking you not to debate me, and I'm not going to debate you, but we're going to come out and we're going to have some honest conversations about what we see, what we hear, what we're feeling like, without being too critical. So I'm trying to get away from shaming and guilting and critiquing, but just laying out the truth as it really is, and then coming together and saying, hey, you know what? We can't continue with the division. If we continue with the division, we will fall. But if we're brave enough, we're going to come together and we're going to truly listen to one another and listen to our mutual truths.
And can I add also just one more thing? In listening lately, these last couple of weeks, and listening to folks, I realize now that what didn't sound offensive to someone, I think it's a matter of telling that someone, I just want you to listen and open your mind. And I think that's where we need to be at a place right now of opening our mind and listening. I'll give you a perfect example. I know that, I saw on social media the debate over the removal of the Aunt Jemima image in the box of a cereal product. And I saw on the internet, somebody asked, well, why? I never thought it was racist. But it wasn't until others in social media, they weren't shaming, but they were more educating and saying, this is why this is offensive to us. And if it's offensive to us, we want you to see how it's offensive to us so that you're more sensitive to our needs. And I think this is where we need to learn. It's one thing, and I've heard, and I started hearing this recently, it's one thing to be, when you say, well, I'm not a racist, but just because you don't say racist things doesn't mean that you're an anti-racist. And I think we need to start learning how to be anti-racist and an anti-racist act, we have to act to remove things that are racist. And those are the things that we need to start doing, acting to be anti-racist, rather than just when people say, I'm not racist because I don't say racist things. Well, an anti-racist, and I think this is where we need to move our level of understanding to a level of educating ourselves, listening. And so I'm learning all these new terms this week about the importance of being an anti-racist versus not being a racist.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Lydia. We actually have a question right now from Carol Ogburn, I'm sorry. It says, to all, as highly educated, respected professionals, have you been personally attacked, physical or mental? If so, has democracy helped? What might I do to help? Well, go ahead and start with Qaed this time, if that's okay.
Sure. I have had the good fortune of never have been physically attacked on the basis of race. And I think that almost everyone's probably suffered some level of mental, verbal abuse at some level for their race. That being said, while I appreciate the question about how has democracy helped, I'm also not quite sure where to go with that. I mean, when we ask whether democracy can help it, are we asking, does the government as an institution give us the avenue to sort of right these wrongs? And at least in the cases that I've been involved with, like these things are not something you can go to city council or something to sort of fix, right? These are the sort of microaggressions, the sort of things that you're just going to deal with all the time. And that's just part of the reality of, until we make more fundamental institutional changes, those specific instances can't be helped. And I do think sometimes our attention gets caught up and very focused on very poignant instances of where racism becomes out in the open. When we think about white supremacy, as Dr. Nguyen had mentioned it, we immediately think about like the Klan and so on, but the much more insidious and much more problematic part of it is how deeply embedded and institutional it is in our lives. So sorry, I kind of went way off track with that, but that's sort of how I feel in general to that. When you ask about what you might be able to do personally to help, I think conversations like this is where we begin, pitching into all the organizations that are dedicated to helping fighting institutional racism at its root level is sort of the slow, steady, and quite honestly very boring and unrewarding but important work that has to be done.
Yeah.
Thank
Lydia
you,
or Cliff?
Dr.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Do you guys have a
Right now.
comment on the last question about your personal experience of having experienced physical
Yes.
violence and how democracy has helped or not helped?
Yes.
Well,
Lydia or Cliff? Yeah.
Yeah, what comes to mind? One particular personal experience I had, and I laugh, and please forgive me for laughing because it definitely is not something that is humorous given what has happened over the last few days. But I live in a community that is predominantly white and has a faith, a religion that not until 1972 or 78 actually recognized that black men could be elders in the church. But I used to run quite a bit before I became an old man. I used to run a lot. And there was a office building that I often ran around, and I would stop in to get a drink of water. And I had done this for 2 years. And 2 days after the O.J. Simpson situation, I began to have police officers following me. And one police officer followed me to my home, and he told me that I was no longer allowed to get a drink of water at this building site. That was very hurtful. That was very painful. My wife tried to convince me no longer to run around that area, but I continued to do so. Another incident occurred when I became an educator for a gifted program. And the gifted program had been guided by someone who was white. And so I had parents who called the school district and said that I was not qualified to teach their children. So those situations are the ones that I can talk about. The chances are extremely high that I've been profiled or have been talked about covertly that I'm not aware of. But it does happen. So the question was, has it ever happened to me? Yes. But I can tell you that it made me even stronger to make sure that not only I was entitled to my rights, but that others who identify as people of color also have rights as well.
Thanks, Cliff. How about you,
Thank you.
Lydia?
Yes, well, I've experienced it both covertly and overtly. When and I'll share with you that covertly, I think a lot of people of color have experienced some sort of racism in one way or another, whether it's because a police officer has stopped us, maybe they questioned us, and I remember. And I remember even in the grocery stores or in the regular stores when I was younger, I was shopping and I was followed around as if I was going to steal something. I looked around and I realized that I was the only Hispanic in the store, and I realized why I was being followed around. And so, they didn't have to say anything to me, but I knew. But as things started changing with you know uh, TV shows that are inserting racism and going into the living rooms of family homes, um, overt just statements, blunt statements about um, people of color maybe being thugs. They've we've had this president address my people as rapists, drug dealers, thugs, bad hombres, and it's quite hurtful and it's painful. And a lady in the grocery store told me to go back to Mexico, and I'll just say that was very painful because the reason she said it was because I was speaking Spanish to my mother while we were waiting for the cashier to cash us out in line at the grocery store. And I'll never forget it. It was so painful. I'm sorry. But my mother I don't think she's ever experienced something like this. To me, it was like somebody yanked me by the hair and I wanted to lash out and offend her horribly. But, you know, um, my mom was more in shock. We, the cashier apologized, and I actually responded to her, and I spoke to her in English, and she was quite surprised that I spoke to her in English. But these are the types of things that we're seeing more and more, and there is a lot of divisiveness that's taking place right now, and it's pitting um, this us versus them. This whether it's people of color, whether it's people that are not from this country or perceived to be not from this country, people that have accents. So it's causing so much division. There's so much division that's taking place. I think right now, as this moment with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's a great opportunity not only to address the issues with Black Lives Matter, which I believe that is way overdue and we should have addressed it a long, long time ago. But I think that right now is also a perfect time to check ourselves where we are on this conversation and how we could be better in this.
Well, I think that's really important for us to understand that it is a conversation and that it's really important for us to not have it be a monologue, which it has been forever, from the dominant culture to everybody else. And it's so good it's important for us to hear these stories and to not discredit them, but to take them in and empathize with people who have to deal with things. As a white middle class male, I mean, I don't have to deal with the kind of stories that I'm hearing from my friends who are people of color. Let me ask this to all the panelists. I had a conversation, an online conversation, a couple weeks ago with Ahmad Daniels, who some of you know. And Ahmad has been an activist in civil rights for many, many years. And this is following up on Dr. Moon's comment about we need to know what our values are and our beliefs are. And I just don't think, people really give it much thought. I mean, you just kind of grow up and you assume that everybody has the same values, the same beliefs. And what I asked Ahmad was, what can I do? What can white people do? And his question, his suggestion to us, I think, is really helpful, which was, he said, I want to suggest that white people would go into their closet or into their office or wherever it is that they go to be quiet and think, and write down, what does it feel like to be white? And I said, wait a second, I've never thought about what it feels like to be white. And he said, that's exactly the point. The white people that he asks to ask themselves that question have never thought about it because they've never needed to think about it. It's just, they don't think about that I need to be scared running out on my jog. We don't think about having to be yelled at the cashier at the grocery store. It's just so outside of our experience. So just a question to all the panelists to maybe say how that resonates with you, and if that sounds like something that would be a good thing to do or a variation of that. Kayed.
Yeah, am I in trouble? So, yeah, no, I think that the heart of engaging with issues of racism is discomfort. As you mentioned, we have to challenge the narratives we grew up with, and these are sort of built into who we are. In a way, think of it as the sort of the diet that you're eating your whole life, and it just becomes part of you. And I think that when you grow up to a certain point and your body's really grown into a certain place, to be told, oh yeah, that's not good, this part of who you are, that comes from a legacy of really bad things, it can be intensely discomforting. And it's the intuitive action, I think, for all of us. And I'm speaking as a man, right? Because I don't want to deal with my inner misogyny. So as a metaphor and analogy to racism, that I would rather push away and say, actually, you know what, maybe everything's just fine. And I don't want to deal with how things are much less fair for, women. But instead to embrace how uncomfortable that is. And that's the only way you can begin to have that conversation. I think that for people of color, and that awful anecdote that Lydia had shared, these are experiences that we all have. And, whether you're a child or an adult, these experiences constantly put you in states of discomfort. So you're forced to ask yourself questions like, I imagine that Lydia right there and then in that place where she was asked to go back to Mexico had to ask herself, did I do anything to deserve this? And we do that. We ask ourselves, did we do something wrong without even questioning the framework under which we're being interrogated, which is there's something wrong with us because of our race. And so I would say that because of the discomfort that we all grow up with, we end up having to challenge the sort of framework that we live inside. Like, is there anything wrong with being who I am, right? I used to, as a kid, I used to yank my nose all the time because I was hoping I could get it to look more European in a sense, right? Because I felt very bad about my own body image and stuff. And you don't even think about it. You don't know why you're doing it, right? It's just been embedded into part of who you are. And so if you're someone who's asking, well, what can I do to sort of help, join this conversation, put yourselves in those really uncomfortable positions, right? Watch the shows, listen to the podcast. Those are the first things you can do that put you into the voices and the narratives of the people who don't just spout the narratives you're used to, then start to join the organizations and the groups and talk to people who you feel uncomfortable with. And I'll just leave with one last thing. I saw once on the Humans New York page on Facebook, there was a construction worker who felt intensely out of place because almost everyone he was surrounded by, and I can't remember who they were they Filipino or something, he felt extremely out of place and upset all the time until he realized that, it was just, he had to go out there and he had to start, placing himself in a situation that he didn't belong to inherently, and he wasn't used to that experience. And I think that that is sort of the first step forward.
Thanks.
Thank you.
If I could add,
Cliff.
Yeah. I was just going to add just a couple of thoughts. Daniel Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. And what Daniel Goleman talks about, especially when we're having these conversations around issues that are related to diversity, that if we're a part of the dominant group, that we, number one, have to be self-introspective. And what he says about being self-introspective is that you have to really take a critical look at who you are, what you're doing, and what you're saying, and what you're feeling, without having feelings of guilt and having feelings of shame. The second piece to that, Daniel Goleman says that we, in our society, we try to move away from issues that cause us any sort of discomfort. We're in a society where, hey, I want to take a pill because I feel bad. I want a magic potion that's going to make me stronger. And what he says is that we have to embrace that discomfort in order to move forward, to embrace the humanity of ourselves and to embrace the humanity of others. And so we also, thirdly, have to be color brave and not color blind. What I hear sometimes, especially from educators, is, hey, I don't see you as black, or I don't see my students as black or brown or Asian. Well, by doing that, by taking that concept, you are denying their identity. You are denying who they are. You're denying their experiences, their cultural backgrounds. So once we can do that, and also know, once we do that, we're still going to make mistakes. And that does not mean that you're necessarily a bad person. It's taken years to get to the point where you are, and it's probably going to take years for you to move towards embracing differences in an authentic way.
So maybe I can just ask a question first. First of all, each of you in your own way, really raising up that we can't be in dialogue, we can't listen unless we really are prepared to embrace discomfort. And I'm wondering from each of the panelists, just a couple minutes, because Azra, this has been so great. It's hard to believe that we've got about 10 minutes left. So could each of you, in a few minutes, just recommend, and Azra, maybe there's a way to capture this for those that aren't writing it down right now, to get recommendations from each of the panelists for either, Kaid, you mentioned a podcast, maybe it's a podcast, a book, a movie that would help fill in all that we don't know. So recommendations?
Well, I have some recommendations. I call these the please don'ts, okay? So let me just go through these really quickly, all right? When we're engaging in these difficult conversations that we must have and embracing our discomfort, here's my please don't. Don't always task me with the responsibility of teaching you how to interact with diverse groups. It should not always be on me. It should be part of your responsibility. The other one is, please don't always expect me to be the spokesperson for members of the identity group that I identify with. The next one is, please don't expect me to always forgive you for the racial mistakes that you make on a continuous basis if you're not willing to change. And please don't expect me to say that I'm okay with all the racial injustice that is happening in the world today, and that somehow we will eventually get over it.
Yeah.
A couple of books that I would recommend.
Thank you.
There's a book by Anastasia S. Kim. It's called It's Time to Talk and Listen. And then another book that I would recommend by an author named Kendi is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And just like Lydia was talking about, it's not enough to be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist. You have to challenge the status quo.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Moon. Yeah. Lydia, some suggestions for us?
Yes, one that recently had a whole new significance and a whole new meaning to me, though I've seen it before, and now that I see it again, it really moves me, is an experiment by a teacher named Jane Elliott. It's the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment. You can Google it, Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment. And
Yes.
what this teacher did is she separated her students with students with blue eyes and students with brown eyes. And the first thing she said are the students with brown eyes were smarter. They had better capacity. They were much better human beings. They were so and she put them in a different level than the blue eyes students. And the blue eyes students, she said that they were not as smart, that they were less than, that they were a second class. And so she actually had the students evaluate to see how it is that they made them feel, and to see what being what how superiority what feels like, and what and racism feels like. And I think teaching this at the young kids, and then hearing her speak to college students about this experiment is so moving and so eye-opening. And I think this is something that every person in this country needs to see. If they've already seen it before, they need to see it again, because I can tell you that if you see it again, it's going to have a whole new meaning to you, especially in light with everything that we're seeing now, because we need to open our eyes to what is happening. And this is one way to start, by being anti-racist, not just non-racist. It's an anti-racist.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.
Kay, did you have a recommendation for us?
Any recommendations?
I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction with this. Dr. mentioned earlier that whenever we have a little pain, we try to take a pill, and we always try to go and find this product that we can pay a few dollars for and immediately solve our problems. And while I think it's amazing that people are now, how to be an anti-racist but candy is flying off shelves because it's showing up on all these different lists about books you need to read to become an anti-racist, we also have to avoid the temptation of thinking we can cure ourselves by purchasing a few products that we can read. Rather, we have to also begin to adopt these sort of diets, right? These sort of exercise regimens, if you will, that help create a healthier social and psychological sort of approach to dealing with these issues. So I think that in general, anything that has people of color on the director's chair, people who are writing, movies and books or TV shows, if you can find that there's actual people of color in the writer's room and a director's chair, these generally tend to, especially if you're independent, create much more genuine and authentic feeling behind what you're trying to approach there. And then also one of my favorite podcasts is, I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with it, is On Being with Krista Tippett. She actually just rebroadcast something from a couple of years ago, and it's with Eula Biss and talking about whiteness. And I think that's an incredible interview that she does. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, Krista Tippett interviews a lot of people on issues of social issues, but also spirituality. And I think it's an incredible podcast to look into. And then finally, I think Still Processing, I enjoy that podcast a lot. It's two culture writers from the New York Times, and they just pick up movies and stuff, and they just talk about, what that looks like from the, sort of racial perspective, and they are really funny. But it's also interesting because we just don't see those, we don't, in general, in the mainstream media, talk about perspectives of how we look at how movies are created. And what the messages they're reflecting are. And so it's very illuminating.
Ask our panelists, who each one of you are amazing, by the way, really fabulous. Anything, Dave?
Yeah, I just want to lift up that what I've heard and have sensed from all of you is the admonition to not shy away from being disturbed, from being uncomfortable. And I think that's something that we need to aspire to. And there are all kinds of trite platitudes about, nothing worth doing is easy and all of those kind of things. But I think in this case, we as a culture have been so mesmerized by ease and comfort and convenience that we're out of practice in doing the hard thing. So I want to thank you for reiterating that, and want to say that that is something that I will take away with me from this conversation and want to share with others
Yes.
as well.
Yes. Thank you all very, very much for joining us. This was an honor, I know, for my co-hosts and myself to be in this conversation with you. And as you know, we're very happy to invite you back for next Tuesday, and we look forward to spending some more time with you. And thank you so much for agreeing to do that. Thank you, Cliff Moon, Lydia Guzman, and Qaed Mai. Thank you very much, all three of you. We have a comment from one of our listeners. A great podcast is Seeing White by Seen On, which explains the history of race we got to where we are today. So that seems to be a recommendation from one of our audience members. For those who have been with us this evening, thank you very much for joining us. Please join us again as we continue this conversation and and respond to more of your questions on Tuesday, June 23rd, right here at 6:30 p.m. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Azra. Nice to be with you, everybody. God bless.
Well,
Outrage sparked around the world. A black man killed under the knee of a white police officer.
Charge 5!